Just before sunrise on February 21st, 2006, police were called to a stretch of Pacific Coast Highway near Malibu, California. When they arrived, they found pieces of a Ferrari scattered across the roadway. Not just any Ferrari, this was an Enzo, one of the most exclusive cars in the world, worth around $1 million at the time, and judging by the wreckage, whoever had been inside it should have been very badly hurt. But standing near the scene was a Swedish businessman named Stefan Eriksson, and somehow he was alive. His most obvious injury was a cut to his lip. Police wanted to know what had happened, and that was when the story became strange, because Eriksson told them he hadn't been driving. The driver, he said, was a German man named Dietrich. He didn't know Dietrich's last name, and Dietrich was no longer there. According to Eriksson, the man had survived the crash, then disappeared into the hills. At the time, the Ferrari Enzo was one of the most extreme road cars ever built. Ferrari had produced only a few hundred of them. It had a 12-cylinder engine, more than 600 horsepower, and a body built extensively from carbon fiber. It was designed to bring Formula One technology to the street. And early that morning, this particular Enzo had been traveling very fast. Exactly how fast became a matter of debate. Early estimates put the Ferrari well above 150 miles per hour. Later reconstruction suggested it may have been approaching 200. And at those speeds, something almost insignificant became catastrophic. There was a small, uneven section of pavement. At normal speed, it would barely have mattered, but the Ferrari was moving so quickly that it scraped the roadway, lost stability, and left the road. It became airborne, came back down, skidded, then left the pavement again. Moments later, the Ferrari struck a wooden utility pole with enormous force. The car was torn apart. Debris was scattered along a huge stretch of Pacific Coast Highway. The rear of the Ferrari separated from the passenger compartment, yet the carbon fiber section surrounding the occupants remained largely intact. That was probably one of the main reasons anyone survived. And Stefan Eriksson had not only survived. He was standing there, talking to police, but according to him, the person they really needed to find was Dietrich. Police took the claim seriously enough to search. A helicopter was brought in. Search teams looked through the surrounding area. They were trying to find an injured German man who had supposedly just climbed out of a destroyed Ferrari and run into the hills. But they found nobody. No Dietrich. There was another man at the scene named Trevor Carney, and his story was nearly as strange. Carney said he hadn't been in the Ferrari either. According to him, he had been traveling in a Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren that had been following the Enzo. The McLaren was another extremely expensive exotic car. Carney said that after the Ferrari crashed, he got out of the Mercedes to help. Then the person driving the Mercedes panicked and drove away without him. So police were being asked to believe that two exotic cars had been traveling together at high speed. One had crashed, the driver of that car had vanished, and the driver of the second car had also vanished. The only two people left at the scene both claimed they hadn't been driving anything. That was already difficult to explain. Then another detail appeared. Carney had borrowed a passing motorist's phone to report the crash. Later, that motorist found something underneath the seat of the vehicle, a loaded pistol magazine. Now police weren't just looking at a bizarre high-speed crash. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. And then two more men reportedly appeared at the scene claiming some kind of connection to Homeland Security. That only added another layer to the confusion, because the man standing beside the wreckage wasn't simply an unlucky Ferrari passenger. Once investigators started looking into Stefan Eriksson, they discovered that his life was much more complicated than it first appeared. Eriksson was from Sweden, and long before he became associated with million-dollar Ferraris, he had a substantial criminal history there. Swedish police had known about him for years. His past included convictions involving financial crime, drugs, weapons, and violence. He had also been associated with a criminal group in Sweden that became known in the media as the Uppsala Gang. But by the early 2000s, Eriksson had reinvented himself. He had moved into the technology business, and eventually he became a senior executive with a company called Gizmondo. Gizmondo was trying to become a major player in the handheld video game market. The company developed a portable gaming system designed to compete with products from companies like Nintendo and Sony. And for a while, Gizmondo projected the image of a company with enormous ambition. It had a prominent London presence. It held extravagant promotional events. Celebrities appeared at launches, and its executives lived extremely well. Eriksson drove expensive cars. There were yachts, luxury homes, watches, travel, and an extraordinary amount of money being spent. But behind the image, Gizmondo was collapsing financially. During one 9-month period in 2005, the company generated only a few $1 million in revenue while losing more than $250 million. Then reporters began looking into Eriksson's past. His criminal history became public. He resigned from the company in late 2005. A few months later, Gizmondo Europe filed for bankruptcy. And roughly 1 month after that, the Ferrari Enzo exploded across Pacific Coast Highway. Now investigators began asking a different question. Where had the Ferrari come from? Because Eriksson didn't just have one exotic car, he had two Ferrari Enzos, and he also had a Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. Together, the cars were worth several $1 million. But there was a problem. Financial institutions in Britain claimed that the vehicles were still subject to lease and financing agreements, and according to authorities, those agreements did not allow the cars to be removed from Britain, yet somehow all three had ended up in California. One of them was now destroyed. The others were still somewhere in the Los Angeles area. Then, about a month after the crash, police found the McLaren. Eriksson's wife was driving it in Beverly Hills. An officer noticed the European license plate and stopped the car. She reportedly did not have a valid driver's license. The McLaren also wasn't properly registered in the United States. Police contacted authorities in Britain, and the car was seized. What had started as a question about a Ferrari crash was now turning into an investigation involving multi-million-dollar cars, overseas lenders, and a bankrupt technology company. But there was still one basic question that hadn't been answered. Who had actually been driving the Enzo? And for that, investigators turned to the car itself. Inside the wreckage was one of the most important pieces of evidence, the driver's side airbag. There was blood on it. Investigators obtained DNA, and the results pointed to Stefan Eriksson, the man who had told police that he was only the passenger. Investigators concluded that Eriksson had been driving the Ferrari. Witness evidence also placed Trevor Carney in the passenger seat. That meant the story about the mysterious Mercedes was falling apart too. And suddenly, Dietrich became much harder to explain. If Eriksson had been driving, then who was Dietrich? By this point, authorities had learned that Eriksson had obtained a one-way ticket to Britain. In April 2006, police arrested him. The case against him grew well beyond the crash itself. Authorities accused him of improperly taking the exotic cars out of Britain. There were also weapons allegations. Eventually, the case went to trial. The first jury could not reach a verdict. Later, Eriksson accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded no contest to charges involving the exotic cars and illegal firearm possession. He was sentenced to prison. But even after Eriksson's legal problems caught up with him, one piece of the story remained unresolved. Dietrich. The German driver who supposedly ran into the Malibu hills had never been found. And Trevor Carney, the man who said he had arrived in the mysterious McLaren, had disappeared. Authorities searched for him for more than a year. Then, in 2007, Carney resurfaced. He was arrested in California, and investigators made an extraordinary claim. They believed Trevor Carney had been the person behind the Dietrich story. Not that he had actually been driving the Ferrari. Investigators believed Stefan Eriksson was the driver. Carney was the passenger, but police believed Carney had helped create the story of the mysterious German named Dietrich, the man who had supposedly walked away from a near 200-mile-per-hour Ferrari crash, then vanished into the hills. And that is what makes this crash so unusual. The most spectacular part of the story is the thing that happened first. A $1 million Ferrari traveling at extraordinary speed was torn apart on Pacific Coast Highway. A man walked away from it almost uninjured. That alone should have been the entire story. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because once police started trying to answer the simplest question, who was driving, they uncovered a bankrupt video game company, millions of dollars in exotic cars, questionable security connections, firearms, overseas financing, and a man with a long criminal history who had reinvented himself as a technology executive. The Ferrari didn't create Stefan Eriksson's problems. It simply made them impossible to hide. And it all started with a $1 million car, a stretch of highway near Malibu, and a man named Dietrich, who, as far as police could tell, was never really there.